Good morning, Wellsians. I'm André Lynch, your Associate Dean for Equity and Inclusion, and thank you all for joining me this morning on this day, this very fruitful day in American history. 9/11, we're coming together to remember those who had lost their lives and who gave their lives for this nation on that day. Prior to us starting this morning, I'd like to begin with our native land acknowledgement as follows. Wells College recognizes our collective responsibility to acknowledge our colonial history. This land is the traditional land of the Cayuga Nation, a member of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Wells College commits itself to ensuring the traditions and culture of Indigenous peoples are embraced and reflected upon in order to engage in solidarity with the Cayuga Nation. With that, I'd also like to open us up with the singing of the national anthem by our very own Henry's Eights.
Good morning, everybody, on this sad and somber day of remembrance. It mystified me when I first came to Wells College 5 years ago, why it is that we didn't do anything in memory of September 11th. And several years ago, a group of students came to me and brought this to my attention, and I agreed. The students really made helped actually to develop the framework for this program. So I want to first let you know that it is your own student body that made this annual Day of Remembrance a reality of Wells. It's only through our memories, our stories, and our collective pursuit of knowledge that we begin to understand the complexity and tragedy of something like 9/11. I want to personally thank those students who felt it was so important that we acknowledge this important day. It was about a year ago on September 11th that I first met André. It was unknown to both of us that at that time, that in a small way, our lives collided on September 11th. I was president of Farmingdale State College on Long Island, and I had been there for literally 1 month. André was a child student at a school very close to the World Trade Center. We found out last year on September 11th that we both had our own recollections of that day and in the days ahead after the attack. Before I speak about September 11th, I want to briefly tell you a story. The year I graduated from college, 1978, I took a sleeping bag and a tent, and I went to travel across Europe through Belgium, France, Germany, and Switzerland. I traveled on $5 a day, eating one meal each day. You couldn't do that today. And many nights I slept in campgrounds. One day that stands out in my mind was the day I visited Auschwitz, a concentration camp outside of Munich. I spent several hours walking through the barracks and site where the ovens were located, where hundreds of thousands of Jews were exterminated. As I was leaving the camp, I sat on the lawn, unable to speak or to move. There was a sign outside the camp, and it read in French the words, "Never again." I wish that statement, "never again," was true, because since that time, there have been countless instances of genocide and mass incarceration in our world. However, not since Pearl Harbor had there been an attack of this magnitude on United States soil. Looking out my window and remembering September 11th when I arrived at work, it was really a seemingly unremarkable day. The weather was beautiful, the sun bright, and it was one of those clear days when there wasn't a single cloud in the sky. People were saying goodbye to summer and welcoming in the fall. They were going about their business, heading to work or to school or to wherever it was they were going. No one suspected or guessed that their lives and the world they knew it were about to be changed forever. That morning at 5:45 a.m., 19 terrorists passed through airport security. The terrorists coordinated hijackings of 4 passenger jets that resulted in the deaths of nearly 3,000 victims and the injuries of more than 6,000. Among the 2,753 victims who died in the World Trade Center were 343 firefighters and 60 police officers from New York City and the Port Authority, 8 private emergency medical technicians and paramedics. Another 184 people were killed in the attacks on the Pentagon. There were no survivors from any of the flights, and the overwhelming majority of casualties were civilians, including nationals from over 70 countries. When the first plane hit the World Trade Center towers, I was in the boardroom at Farmingdale State, just 38 miles from what was soon to be called Ground Zero. As I said, I'd only been there for 1 month. We were having a meeting, and all the vice presidents and deans were with me. I wasn't ready to comprehend what was happening that day when my administrative assistant came in and told us that a plane had just hit one of the trade towers. I assumed it was a small private plane like the one that hit the Empire State Building back in the 1940s. A little while later, she came back in and told us that these were jets and the second tower had been hit, and she was crying at this time. All of a sudden, the dean of the College of Business went completely white and told me that her husband worked in the World Trade Center. I took her to my office and she called him repeatedly until she finally was able to reach him. He said he was safe and trying to get out, and then the phone went dead. She didn't hear from him again until several hours later, after the buildings had collapsed and he was on a ferry to New Jersey. He barely escaped. Afterwards, he told me that he could see into the faces of those in the cockpit of the airplane as it flew into the building. He was featured on biography during a television show called I Survived. His name is Fred Eichler. I also called my wife Lori to be sure she was safe. Thankfully, she was home in our apartment. I called my brother and found out that my sister-in-law was in Manhattan, but she was safe in trying to get home. As well, a friend of mine worked for the Port Authority, and he actually was on the train on his way into the World Trade Center for a meeting, but that meeting was canceled at the very last minute. So suddenly, everything we took for granted, everything we understood, every part of our daily lives was completely upended. Having no airplanes over New York City was almost as unusual as hearing a jet fly over Allegheny County in Maryland. That silence in New York City was deafening. On top of that, my campus was down the road from a small regional airport. Military fighter planes were flying low over Manhattan and flew over my campus. I was suddenly having to deal with the reality of a crisis for which I never was prepared nor ever even imagined. And at that time, no one was certain that this was the end because, as you know, the island of Manhattan and Long Island are just that, they're islands. We felt trapped. What if further attacks focused on tunnels and bridges? There would be no way to get out. The Long Island Expressway, a major road into Manhattan, was closed only for emergency vehicles. We've moved mattresses into our student center. We brought in food and televisions. We made the campus available to offer support to emergency workers. We began collections of food and water to send into Manhattan. We closed the campus temporarily. As time went on and we began to grasp what was happening, we had students who were either children of, or in one case, the spouse of a firefighter. These people were not yet understanding that their loved ones would perish. Loved ones who ran up the stairways of the towers, not even imagining that the buildings could collapse. Who would even imagine that could happen? When the South Tower came down, people working in the North Tower were informed in the rescue operation and they were ordered to leave. But many of them, because of who they were as human beings, they didn't leave. They kept working to try to get people out safely. In time, I got to know the Long Island firefighters, and I came to realize what a fiercely loyal group of people they were. They were so committed to honoring their colleagues, and each year on the anniversary of 9/11, we held a memorial service where hundreds and hundreds of people were present. Many of them were families of firefighters and other emergency responders who wanted to remember their loved ones. We built several 9/11 memorial gardens on campus, one in front of the administration building that became a place where students, faculty, and staff would sometimes just sit and reflect on 9/11. I used to watch them from my office window, and sometimes I'd go sit in the garden by myself. Unbelievable, but it's been 20 years since 9/11. It's hard to believe that so much has gone by. Some of you weren't even born when 9/11 occurred. I've been to the 9/11 memorial in the Pentagon. It lies directly inside a bank of windows where the first jet hit the building. While I was there, I signed their guest book and thought about what it must have been like when the building filled with smoke and suffered a partial collapse. Been to the World Trade Center site. In fact, years ago, I was driving by the site with my wife and my 10-year-old nephew, 10 at the time. And all he could say was it was so sad. Even as a young boy, he understood how tragic it was. For many months after 9/11, there was a sense of sadness and awareness in Manhattan that I truly hadn't witnessed in my lifetime. People seemed to be more concerned for each other than for themselves. It was an unexpected outcome of a city where the pace of life is very fast and sometimes lacking in compassion. There were parks in the city where photos and memorials appeared as people continued to search for their loved one. But beyond that, people were scared. When airlines could resume travel, there were times when airplanes flew overhead that I myself, and I noticed that people ducked because there was still that sense of fear inside of them. And when I went to DC for the first time, I saw something I'd never seen. On top of the Capitol and White House, there were armed soldiers who were prepared now for any crisis, and they stay there today. Our nation began to speak about alert levels, and there were armed guards at all the tunnels into Manhattan. The Patriot Act was passed, and it was permissible, if there was any suspicion, that people could be detained and questioned, cell phones could be monitored, citizens of this country could be watched and followed. In many ways, I think our nation will never be the same today as it was before 9/11. Our economy collapsed. We continue to be at war, and the cost of those wars has been in the trillions of dollars, with well over 1 million civilians and military personnel killed from countries involved. It took 10 years for the United States to hunt down and kill Osama bin Laden for his crimes against humanity. I wonder what it will ultimately take for our nation to heal and for our world to be a place where people strive to understand each other. Ladies and gentlemen, I can tell you that we don't live in that world right now, and how sad it is 20 years later that we don't live in a world of compassion and kindness and understanding for all people, to understand their lives and their lived experience and who they are as human beings. And this is the world that I hope all of you will work hard to create every day of your lives. And it starts with your education and having an open mind. It starts with living and working every day, with working with people from different countries, people who are from different races, genders, and ethnicities. It starts with the recognition that we're all really on this planet for a very short time, and that our positive contributions to building a better society are what will prevent 9/11 from ever happening again. So today I ask all of you, please don't forget those people who perished on 9/11, those who died rescuing them, and all who have perished fighting for freedom in our country. Thank you.
Thank you, President Gibralter. I'd like to invite Chris Pollock, Director of Communications, to speak. Chris?
Sorry, I just had to figure out how to unmute. Good morning, everyone. I'm Chris Pollock, Director of Communications and Marketing here at Wells. I want to thank André and Mary for putting this tribute together, and for President Gibralter and Mollie for their participation as well. 19 years ago this morning, I was in downtown Washington, D.C. I was 26 years old, and I had just arrived at work. One thing, like President Gibralter also noted, that I remembered most vividly about that day was it was so sunny and so beautiful, and there wasn't a cloud in the sky. At the time, I was working in the public affairs office at National Geographic. I suddenly heard several shouts of horror come from my boss's office, where several colleagues were watching the news and saw live at that moment the second plane hit the World Trade Center. Within just about 10 or 15 minutes, we were suddenly told to evacuate the building and to go home or go to a safe place. What followed was a scene of, chaos and, quite frankly, panic that until that point I could only have imagined happening in a movie. This street's open, now it's closed. That place is open, now it's closed. I managed to, catch a subway train, only to be told to get off a few stations later. I hadn't even made it to my home stop yet. Rumors abounded, like that a plane was heading for the White House or that the State Department had been struck. No one knew what to believe or what was happening. So I ended up walking the rest of the way home to my apartment just across the Potomac River in Arlington, Virginia. My apartment was just a couple of miles up from the Potomac River from the Pentagon. And I saw the smoke rising, but I didn't know really what it was until later that day when I turned on the TV and heard that the Pentagon had also been struck. In retrospect, that's why people thought that the State Department had been struck, because they were seeing the smoke from the Pentagon and assumed it was in the State Department, which was in the line of sight. Another thing I remember was that cell service had become all but impossible for the next 24 hours for most people. Phone lines were jammed. And thus my contact with the outside world during the rest of that day was limited to just the internet, email, and television. It was a surreal environment, to say the least. What I didn't find out until the next day was that two of my fellow employees from National Geographic were on that flight that struck the Pentagon. One of them was Ann Judge, the head of the travel office. Being National Geographic, there was a staff of people that, had to support finding travel arrangements for, photographers and writers going all over the world, and Ann was the head of that office. The other was Joe Ferguson, who worked in the Educational Programs Division. I had never met Joe, but Ann I knew quite well. She was right down the hall from me, and we talked all the time. I still remember her husky laugh and her fondness for Diet Coke, two things brought on by a lifetime of cigarette smoking. Ann and Joe were accompanying a group of DC area middle school teachers and students on a trip to a marine sanctuary in California that day. They were both extraordinarily beloved by their peers who recalled their positivity, helpfulness, and willingness to make the world a better place. As the days went on, our lives would be impacted in other ways as details continued to emerge. For example, my wife's roommate at the time lost her own brother at the World Trade Center. And my wife also had a couple of students at her school whose fathers perished at the Pentagon. In the coming days, things would be even more surreal. Soldiers with machine guns posted on street corners, seeing the gaping hole in the Pentagon as it drove on the highway beside it, and so forth. And like President Gibralter had said, it's difficult to describe what a shocking event this was for ourselves and our country. You know, when I was a kid, terrorism was something that we thought only happened in faraway countries. But in an instant, everything changed, and America would no longer be immune from the consequences of policies that it and other countries had pursued in the Middle East for decades. And every year at this time, I mourn Ann and Joe and the 2,975 other individuals who lost their lives that day. It's been said that the current coronavirus pandemic is the biggest national crisis in America since 9/11, and that's true, and in many ways, it is much worse. To put it into perspective, the number of Americans who died from COVID in the past week alone equals the number who perished on 9/11. But I think the two things that link our current crisis with September 11th is how it helped bring our country together and how it helped make people a little more tolerant, at least for a time. For a while after 9/11, people were kinder to one another and understanding of the new reality that we were suddenly thrust into. You know, heck, even in downtown DC, it seemed like people were honking less at each other. But, you know, in the end, I hope that what you can take away from this is that we can all continue to work harder to help create and sustain a world in which there's just more compassion, more tolerance, and more understanding. Thanks for letting me speak today.
Thank you so much, Chris. So, 9/11. It's incredibly difficult for me to speak about my experience with 9/11, my relationship to this date. As President Gibralter stated a bit earlier, I was, in the major metropolitan area when the planes crashed into the buildings. I was in 6th grade at the time in Mr. Weber's class. Mr. Weber was a great teacher. We're actually going over a history lesson. I forget which one, but I remember Mr. Weber received a phone call during our history lesson, and he never ever would answer the phone during a lesson. So we were all surprised and shocked to see that he picked up his phone. So Mr. Weber picks up his phone, and we kind of all look at each other a little dazzled, right? Maybe he's distracted for a few moments so we can be doing something else that's not doing work in the moment. But then Mr. Weber's face went white. And one thing that kids are really, really good at is reading emotion, right? So all of us in the 6th grade class immediately became worried for Mr. Weber and about whatever situation that he might be hearing on the other end of that phone. Mr. Weber picked up the phone, his face turns white, a tear starts to drop down his cheek, and then he turns to the TV and turns the TV on. And there it is, the two towers, and one of them had been run into by a plane. We have no concept or understanding of what this means or at the time, right? We just know that there is a plane in a building and our teacher seems to be very much so affected by this. Come to find out, Mr. Weber had 2 children who worked in the towers. And that was his daughter, I believe, that was calling him to let him know that she had just ran out of the tower. She had just evacuated the tower to please turn on the news and that she could not find her brother. She had tried calling him several times and just could not reach him. He wound up perishing in the towers that day. And a lot of other folks who were very, very close to myself and my classmates also perished that day, or the days to follow, in rescue missions, for folks to get folks to pull folks from the rubble. My uncle was one of those people. As a first responder who gave his life to run into that building and get people out, he didn't make it out. And I believe the most difficult part for my family in that time was that we weren't able to retrieve an entire body. My uncle had to be identified using DNA from his hairbrush and his toothbrush, supplied by my aunt. And it took weeks. And if I remember correctly, it might have been months. My memory is a little foggy when it comes to the timeline, but it took a considerable amount of time for my uncle's remains to be identified. So although that, and it wasn't until last year when we had this remembrance ceremony that I understood or realized that the events from 9/11 still do deeply resonate and affect me. But the thing that I try to hold on to as best as possible is that a moment like 9/11 shows America who we are, right? When it comes down to it and the stuff hits the fan, we come together because that's who we are. No matter the color of your skin, no matter your socioeconomic background, no matter your age, no matter your gender or your non-gender conforming, we come and we came together. And I was proud of that. And I'm proud to say that my uncle was one of the first responders that came to the World Trade Centers and gave his life, no matter what was in front of him, in front of all of those brave men, women, and non-gender conforming folks, no matter what was in front of them, they knew that in their America, people stood up for one another. People gave their lives for one another in their America. And I think that's what makes this okay. That's what gets me through this day and this just such a tragic time for all of us, and specifically my family as well. So I like to remember that piece, that in the face of tragedy, Americans come together. And what better time to remember that mantra, right, than now, through COVID and the national fight for Black lives, that Americans come together. And as a Wells community, the expectation is that we come together, no matter what that is. Thank you for listening and giving me a moment to share. At this time, I'd like to invite Collegiate President Mollie Walts. Mollie?
Hi, everyone. 9/11 is a day that affects everyone. As we've seen today, virtually everyone has a story of where they were, what they were doing at that time, even if you weren't old enough to remember it or hadn't yet been born. And our Wells community is no exception. Nancy Liz, class of 1984, and Susan Getzendanner, class of 1965, both lost their lives in the attacks on the World Trade Center. We join together today to compassionately honor and remember these two Wells alumni and the almost 3,000 other individuals who were killed on September 11, 2001. We honor and remember those who were injured during the attacks and the many who rose in service and response, the first responders, the volunteers, the rescue and recovery workers, the uniformed safety personnel, and the hundreds of thousands of others who serve or have served in our armed forces here at home and overseas. I'd now like to ask you to join me in a moment of silence. Thank you.
Thank you, Mollie. And thank you, President Gibralter and Chris Pollock, Mary, and all of you who have joined us this morning. Please take today to share a story about maybe where you were on 9/11. Take a trip to one of our Remembrance gardens, one right in front of McMillan off of the Circle, if you could. Or just take a moment to stop, breathe, and be silent and be grateful for the breath that you have, for being able to look up and see the sky and the sun. Say thank you and show compassion. Those are my asks of you for today as we remember 9/11 and all of those brave souls who died and all of those innocent souls who also perished. Take care, you all. Have a great day.